Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are joined by our guest, Adam Nelson, an Olympic gold and silver medalist, a three-time Olympian, and world champion representing Team USA in shot put. Adam is also a member of the board of directors of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, or USOPC. And today, listeners, Adam is going to share more about his athletic career, the circumstances surrounding his 2004 Olympic medal, and his anti-doping advocacy efforts. So, Adam, welcome to the show today. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks for having me on the show today.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we're looking forward to learning more about you and your story. So perhaps we can start at the beginning here, Adam. How did you first discover your passion for shot put?
I hope that this is a message that resonates with a lot of people and the positivity that kind of comes out of a failure, because I was in 8th grade and I was trying out for the baseball team. We had just moved into a new school and it was a very good baseball team. It was the first time playing school sports. And I went out for tryouts, and it was day 2 of tryouts. And the coach called me in after the practice, and he looked towards in my general direction and he said, "Adam, you're just not good."
Oh, no.
He said, "And even if you went and played year round, I just don't think you're going to make it." So it was a pretty harsh delivery, but in my head, I thought it was actually an opportunity, because at the time I thought my primary sport was football, and it was going to give me a lot of opportunity to train and prepare for football as a freshman the following year. So I went home and shared this story with my dad, and I said, "Dad, I got cut from baseball. I'd never been cut from," well, that's not true. I'd been cut from basketball earlier that year, and that was not a huge loss to me. I'm somewhat vertically challenged and can't make a layup, so the writing was on the wall there.
Mm-hmm.
So I went home and talked to my dad, and he said, "Well, son, you've got 2 options. You can go and get a job, or you can go out for another after-school activity." And I like to think that I'm reasonably smart, and given those 2 options, I was like, well, I think I can go out for track and field. And it's a no-cut policy, and the coach for track and field is also the football coach. So I feel like I'm kind of working the system a little bit to my advantage. And in 8th grade, I went out for track and field, and they had us do every single event on the field, basically, or in track. I think I did the 100, the 800, the mile,
Oh, wow.
the pole vault for a day, because that was a little bit terrifying.
Right.
So I ended up really finding my space with the throws over the next 4 or 5 years, and winning 2 state championships in both the shot put and the discus, and having the opportunity to go on to college and do both football and track in college. So that's kind of how it happened. But it came because I got cut from the baseball team. And I like to share that message with people, because so many people think that not making the team that your child wants to make is this incredible failure. And in this situation, it's one of those opportunities that was presented to me that I didn't realize it at the time, but it was going to change the trajectory of my whole life. So that message to me is super important in this day and age, when there's so much pressure to compete and make those top teams, particularly at the youth level, that there is a real opportunity when you're told, no, this isn't for you, and you have the opportunity to explore something else that may end up being a passion that changes your whole life's trajectory.
Absolutely. Well, Adam, I'm so glad you shared this story. And I really love that you changed this disappointment into something positive. And I'm curious, you mentioned you were sort of juggling football and track and field. So what made you decide to ultimately pursue track and field and just sport in general at the elite level?
I wanted to use sports as a way to help me get into the best school that I could get into.
Mm-hmm.
And that was also a good fit culturally for me. And so I ended up going to Dartmouth College, and they let me do both football and track. And I played varsity football all 4 years and did varsity track all 4 years as well. And I was going through corporate recruiting, which at Dartmouth in your senior year, you have all these companies that come to campus and try to recruit you to join their institutions. You interview for them, but it is a recruitment process as well. And I was going through the final stages. I was literally in the last on-campus interview that I had scheduled. I was walking in. I was having some real hesitations about what I wanted to do as a first step after college. And some messages that my college track coach had shared with me about the opportunities that he saw for me in front of me started to resonate. And I walked into this final round interview with this, I won't tell you who I was interviewing with, but it was a fairly large consulting firm at the time. And the guy that was doing the interview was literally, and it may have been an intentional tactic, he was clearly stressed out about something that was going on back at the office. And he made me wait for about 5 minutes as he finished up a phone call. And I just remember in that time saying, this is not the life that I want. And for whatever reason, my coach's message that he'd said to me over, I don't know how many times over the previous 2 or 3 or 4 years, hey, you've got a real gift. You're willing to explore it. And it just resonated with me in that moment. So when the guy hung up the phone, and this is so far outside of my character at the time, that it really is one of those things where I can't believe I actually did this. But I looked at him and he finished up his call. He hung up and he stuck his hand across the table and introduced himself. And I said, "Sir, I am so sorry. I don't want to waste your time. This is not what I want to do." And I just kind of got up and left. And I walked over to my coach's office at the time and I said, "Coach, this is what just happened. And I think I want to go train for the 2000 Olympics." And he just started to laugh and he said, "Well, let's get a plan together." That's how it happened. And I kind of tie it back into the previous story about how did I find shot put. Well, realistically, I was given two options, which was to pursue a sport or go get a job. And I felt like this is the same decision. That's kind of how it happened. And from there, I ended up moving across the country and training with some great coaches and people out at Stanford University. They welcomed me with open arms and moved into a house with 11 other track and field athletes living in it and became the Olympic hopeful.
Oh, that's amazing. And you actually grew up in Atlanta where the 1996 Olympics were held. So at that point, when those 96 Olympics were going on, did you have a sense that you would one day be competing in the Olympics yourself?
Maybe at some level I dreamed of it, but it's interesting. I competed in the 96 Olympic trials and finished basically dead last. I did make it past the original qualifier, but I think I finished 12th. And the footnote to that story is I ended up working at the 96 Olympics in the coffee shop in the Olympic Village, which was kind of interesting as well. A little bit of behind the curtain scene, but I don't know if at that time I really thought that that was an option for me.
Very cool. So can you talk about then how you went from this point of dead last in that round of Olympic trials to getting to the point where you are competing in the 2000 Olympic Games? What were some of the challenges that you faced and how did you overcome them?
The challenges are daily at some level, but the big thing is you've got to figure out how to create stability without any resources to do it. That was the challenge that I was faced with at the moment. The reality was that I wasn't good enough to qualify for any of the funding that was provided to Olympic hopefuls at the time. So I had to find a place that was close, that had quality weather, quality access to competitions, and would also give me the ability to train and work. Those were the first big three things that I worked through. So I landed in California in the Bay Area because the coach at Stanford had previously been the coach at Dartmouth. And so he knew my throws coach at Dartmouth. And he was very open to the idea of me coming out there to train and very supportive. And the throws coach was also a friend of my college coach. So that made sense. And then because I was also interested in finance at the time, I thought I could find a job working the markets that would allow me to get in early and get out early. So I worked at a financial consulting firm for the first year that I was out there, and it was an orientation sort of entry level position in financial consulting. Again, I won't share the name, but it's probably public record out there someplace. They were wonderful with allowing me to work. Like I said, I get into work at about 6 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 in the morning. I then tried to get out about 3 o'clock, but at some point they do want you to start producing. And so that's the real challenge. And when I was working and training and I started getting in at 5:30 to 6 o'clock in the morning, and you get out at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock at night, and then next thing you know, you're getting home from your training at 12:30 or 1 o'clock in the morning, it's not a sustainable pattern.
Yeah.
So that was the real challenge. And my body paid the price for it. I had lots of injuries. I was really inconsistent with my performances at the time. And then just by the stroke of luck, and I say it really was luck, I met a guy who took interest in me for a different reason. There was a group of venture capital companies that used to have something called the Sandhill Challenge, which is a glorified soapbox derby race. So when I think of soapbox derby races, I have this old black and white image of these cardboard boxes, or maybe it's a freight of some sort, like going down a hill. It's not that. This is that with unlimited resources and an uber competitive spirit. And so this particular gentleman recruited me and two of the other guys that I trained with to be the pushers for their soapbox derby car on this thing. And then he connected me to a few other people. And I got connected with this incredible guy named Doug Merritt, whose name I'll share here just because he was such a gift to me at that time. And he'd been a national level triathlete, and he had started up this company maybe 2 years before and said, "Hey, look, I love your story. I want to help you. You're a smart guy. You're young. You're competitive. Let me find a place for you on my team." And so he did. That was probably the biggest game-changing moment of my pre-Olympic hopeful career, was finding a way, a lifestyle, if you will, a work-life balance that allowed me to train in a way that allowed me to actually be restored every time I stepped into the weight room or stepped into the circle. I wasn't just fighting weeks or months worth of accumulated fatigue. So it was a real gift. there's no way that I could have made that happen or predicted that would happen. You just have to sometimes be in the right place at the right time. And that's what happened there.
Definitely. And I think your story really highlights just this power of this combination of luck and networking, but you also being really resourceful and open-minded and willing to do whatever it takes to get there, because the training is tough. But you also, as you alluded to, have to support yourself financially and take care of yourself and do all of these other things that need to get done in the day. And it's not easy to balance that schedule.
No, it's definitely not. And the one piece of advice, if anybody wants to take it, I would have is the gift of being an Olympic hopeful is that you have named yourself and committed yourself to a path that people will understand if you're willing to share your pain or share your concerns or share your fears. And it's amazing where the help will come from if you're just willing to say, hey, look, this is what I'm doing. This is the time frame that I have, and this is the support I need. And you need to be very comfortable in asking for that support. The worst that anybody would ever say to my face anyway was good luck. And the best case scenario is they circle back and say, you know what, I'd really love to help you out. And how can I be helpful? And that's happened to me 2 or 3 times in my career. And each time has been just a real blessing. It happened at another opportunity where someone had read my story, and this, we can touch on this as well, but following the 2004 Olympic Games, someone had read my story and found out that I was wanting to go to business school in Charlottesville. And he reached out to me specifically and said, hey, can I take you to lunch? And I said, sure. So I sat down with this gentleman at lunch and he said, how can I help you? And honestly, that question in that particular setting, I didn't have a great answer for. And that's the other thing is you always want to be able to answer that question when people offer their help and answer it truthfully. And anyway, I kind of fumbled through the answer and I said, well, I'm going to grad school and I still want to train for the 2008 Olympics. And I'm going to grad school in Charlottesville, Virginia. And it'd be awesome if I could find a way to help offset those costs. And he said, well, I own the TV stations in Charlottesville. How would you like the job as a sports reporter? And then it was this incredible opportunity that just evolved there. And so on a part-time basis, I got to go work for one of the local Charlottesville TV stations, filming high school sports or even capturing some of the college sports with Virginia, and then creating a package for the actual on-camera real sports guys to actually share on TV. And so I just share that to say somebody at some point, if you identify yourself as an Olympic hopeful, your story is going to resonate with someone and someone's going to come out of the woodwork and offer you an opportunity or offer help. And you just have to be able to answer that question.
I love that. So let's dive into that first Olympic Games in 2000, Sydney, Australia. What was it like for you getting to the point where you qualified and then actually stepping off the plane in Sydney and knowing that you were going to participate in this event?
I'll go back to the end of, towards the tail end of 99. I was actually really at a low for me personally. I had struggled with competitions. It hadn't been a great year competitively. I was on the verge or cusp a lot of times and just hadn't had that big breakthrough yet. And so I was getting frustrated. I'd walked away from the financial consulting firm that I was at and hadn't found the other opportunity yet or met the other gentleman yet at that point. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of in between things. And I suffered a pretty devastating injury during a regular training session. And I tore my right pec muscle in a session and I didn't have health insurance. It was one of those great life lessons that you never really want to learn. But I was very fortunate. And again, with the network that I had, I got connected to an incredible doctor that worked for the 49ers, a guy named Dr. Dillingham, and he agreed to see me. And I walked in to see him and he says, yeah, your pec's torn and you're going to need surgery. And there's no way you're going to compete in the trials.
Oh, no.
The recovery is just too long. And I said, okay. And I'm processing that information and I'm just kind of sitting there. He said, well, I guess there's another alternative. You could do rehab. And if the scar tissue forms just right, you might be able to start being competitive with some pain and discomfort sometime in April or May, and maybe just perfectly by the 1st of July for the Olympic trials. And it was one of those moments where it was kind of like, I don't know if anybody saw the movie Dumb and Dumber, but they're talking about odds of something. He says, so you're saying there's a chance.
Right.
And I just locked in on that chance. And so I got connected with another friend of mine who was also rehabbing an ACL tear. And we would drive up 3 times a week to San Francisco from Palo Alto to train with a physical therapist out there, a lady by the name of Lisa Giannini. And she just destroyed me in a good way. And what was really fascinating about that process is from, I don't know, I think it was November, December, January, February, I couldn't do anything that I traditionally associated with my training. I couldn't stabilize bars. I couldn't carry weights. I really couldn't do a whole lot other than rehab and just trying to be a better athlete by just sprints and jumps. And that was, again, another gift. I became a much better athlete again. I remember going out in March and April of that year and starting to do some stand throws or some simple throws, literally sitting from a chair and throwing a 4K shot. And for those that don't know, 4K is 8.8 pounds, and we throw a 16-pound shot in competition. And sitting there doing these stand throws or these seated throws and being like, hey, this actually doesn't feel bad. There's some discomfort, but it doesn't feel bad. And I kept improving and improving. And then I get this call from USA Track and Field saying that there's a competition in Raleigh, North Carolina. They called me on a Monday. The competition was on Friday. I was working at this time with Doug's company, and they said, can we fly you out on Wednesday? You compete on a Friday and fly you home whenever. And I said, I think I can do that. Anyway, long story short is I show up at this competition and I go from effectively I'd thrown 68 feet or so in competition prior to this competition. And I walk out of that competition throwing just under 71 feet and finish second to one of the number one or number two throwers in the world at the time, a guy named CJ Hunter, who has since passed away, but he had to PR to beat me. So I threw 70 feet, 7 inches there. And that was sort of my announcement coming out party to the world-class level. And then I found myself at the Olympic trials. It's about 6 weeks later, 8 weeks later, just feeling incredible about where I was. And that competition was one of the most incredible competitions of my life in the sense that at the time, the top 5 performances, I think, were the top 5 performances of any competition, with the exception of maybe one in the history of the sport. And on my last throw, I came out and set an Olympic trials record of 72 feet. It was over 22 meters. And I went from being somewhat of a hopeful making the team to being the favorite for the Sydney Olympics. And then it was, okay, how do I prepare for the Olympics after spending 4 years trying to focus on making this Olympic team? And so I tell people on their first Olympic Games, you really have 2 types of athletes. You can be an Olympic tourist, meaning you're kind of just there to enjoy it. Even though you're there to compete, it's the spectacle that you want to enjoy. Or you can be there as a competitor. And I really wanted to compete, obviously. So the pathway to the Sydney Games was to really go from the trials to Europe to stay in competition shape. So that at the time, that's where most of the competitions were throughout the summers. So I did a training camp up in Sweden and one in the Netherlands with some friends there, and was able to compete for 6 or 7 weeks in between the trials and the Olympics themselves. And so that's how I ended up in Sydney. And the story about Sydney was I had a really bad day, to be quite candid. 2 weeks before, I can make an excuse here, but I'm just sharing this as information. I rolled an ankle, and so that kind of messed me up technically. And I'm not the biggest of all the shot putters. And so if I'm not technically proficient, it really impacts my performance. So just relatively speaking, I'm pretty small for a shot putter at the time. I was 6 feet tall. I'm 6 feet tall. I haven't grown since then, but 6 feet, 265 pounds. And most of the guys I competed against were 6'1" to 6'4", 6'5", and maybe 60 pounds to 80 pounds heavier. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I ended up second there and lost to a guy that had a career day. Awesome guy, a guy named Arsi Harhu from Finland, and lost by about 2.5 inches. And so I walked out of that saying 4 more years.
Well, Adam, that was an amazing story. And I'm really glad you had this experience at the Sydney Olympics where you got a taste of it and you were hungry for more. And you went on to compete in the next 2 Olympic Games in 2004 and 2008. But 2004, as many people know if they've seen the headlines, was a particular spectacle, we'll say. So can you talk about what your experience was like at the 2004 Games, which were held in Athens, Greece, kind of the birthplace of the Olympics?
We weren't just in Athens, Greece. We were actually at the original birthplace of the Olympic Games in Olympia, Greece. And so in Olympia, the ancient Olympic Stadium is actually still there. It's an incredible artifact of obviously a time that's long since passed. And originally, I think they were going to have the discus compete there, but for some reason they made a last minute change and moved the shot put. So the men's and women's shot put were actually contested in Olympia. And after making that team, I was incredibly excited about the opportunity to compete in this venue. I love the small venue focused sort of competitions because I love to entertain when I compete, meaning I love to get the crowd involved. And so this seemed like it was tailor made for a fairy tale ending for me. I get to compete at the original ancient Olympic Stadium in a small venue, which is where I really thrive. And for those that haven't been to Olympia, there's not much there. There's an incredible university that's really focused on Olympic history there. And that's where the athletes stayed. But then there's also the Olympic Stadium, the ancient Olympic Stadium, which effectively is a grass bowl with a dust bottom at this point, a dust infield at this point. But there's still this incredible cut slicing the hillsides around this bowl where this arch stands, and this stone archway is, I don't know how many thousands of years it's been there, but certainly well over 2,000. And it's just incredible. And so we were the first competition there since the ancient Olympic Games, and to my knowledge anyway, and I don't think they've used it since. So it was a real honor to walk through some of the remaining artifacts in that area, to step out onto this field where the birthplace of the Olympic Games really started there. So it was pretty incredible.
Well, that's amazing. And I know the competition was intense. Can you talk a little bit more about what your experience was like actually competing there on the field?
The way that shot put competition works is there's two different sections to it. So there's a qualifying round, which is usually throw beyond a hard line, a set distance, or they take the top 12. So the point of that qualifying round is to narrow it down to 12 athletes. And the goal for this format is to qualify on one and go back and rest and get ready for the final that afternoon. Didn't go as well as I wanted to in qualifying. It took me 2 throws to do it. So I got back to the dorm rooms where we were staying and just kind of rested for a bit. And then when I returned, it felt like it was one of the hottest days I think we'd had all year, and certainly one in that area. The thing about the stadium is, particularly this stadium, there's no shade anywhere. And even the stuff that they brought out for the athletes was kind of like one of those portable benches that you see on the side of the soccer fields, where it has this little half ceiling or half archway that kind of comes over the top of it. But it was clear, so it really wasn't providing a whole lot of extra shade for us. I really can remember almost everything about that day. The dust was kicking up, and there were probably 20,000 people there just to see the shot put. My first throw, I stepped in and I had a really great opening throw for me at the time. I felt very comfortable with it. And I took the lead with that throw a little over 69 feet. It was to be very candid, it was a fairly pedestrian distance and certainly well below what I was thinking, but it was a great start. And then for some reason, the wheels just started to fall off. My second throw, I got in and fouled. I think my third throw, I had what I would call a total yard sale of a wipeout, meaning the shot put went one direction. I felt like if my shoes hadn't been tied on, they would have flown off the other. I mean, it was just all over the place. And I just started to laugh a little bit after that one for a second. And I was still leading after 3 throws, but the athlete from Ukraine continued to improve with each throw. And I think he'd thrown 21-12 or 21-13 or something like that. And so I had thrown 21-15 just to give a frame of reference. So it was getting tight. And as everybody will tell you in major competitions, usually the person that continues to improve each round is going to win. So as we go through this whole competition, they go from 12 athletes in the first 3 throws, and they cut it back to the top 8 athletes for the last 3 throws. So there's about 60 throws total in the competition. And on the second to last throw, the athlete from Ukraine who'd been trailing me, he was in second place the whole time, comes out and he ties my best mark. And the tie-breaking rule in shot put in the Olympics, it goes back to your second best mark. Well, I shared that I'd had the wheels were coming off in round 2, 3. It didn't really get any better in 4 and 5. So really only I had one fair mark. And it was one of those situations that you kind of dream about as a kid, at least in the U.S. Like you think about it, it's like, oh, he catches the winning touchdown pass or hits that walk-off home run to win the World Series. This is that moment. I knew that in order to win this competition, I had to throw farther, period, because he'd thrown 21-15. I'd thrown 21-15. His second best mark was 21-14. So I had to throw farther in order to win. And there are probably moments in everybody's life as you get older anyway, that are just so ingrained that if I start thinking about them, it takes me right back to the moment. I can remember walking out into the sector about 40 to 50 feet out of the sector. This is my pre-throw routine, and I hadn't really done it how I normally do it just because of all the dust that had been out there. But I decided this is my last throw and I'm going to make this one count. And I went out into the sector, and I can remember being greeted by a mixture of cheers and boos. Americans aren't always liked in those situations. Mm-hmm. I started to do my clap to get the crowd involved. And I remember when I pulled my shirt off my head, that was my trigger to really get into my competitive state, if you will. And I start walking to the circle, and there's no doubt in my mind what's about to happen. And I can remember stepping to the back of the circle. The crowd is starting to clap in unison. It's incredibly loud. I can feel the beads of sweat like on my neck. I feel the dust. I feel you're just so hyper aware of everything. And the second that shot put touched my neck to start my throw, the world just went quiet. And I can remember as just automatically my body starts going into its throw. And the next thing I know, the world explodes back to life. I feel the shot put just explode out of my arm. and I'm yelling at it, knowing that it just left. I raised my hands in victory. I'm like, I just won the Olympic Games. I knew with that throw that I won the Olympic Games. And I look to the left and I see the red flag go up, indicating that I'd fouled again. And I didn't feel a foul. And my response at the time was to dispute the call. And then they showed me the video and it was a clear foul. And I remember going over to the official and saying, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I apologize for yelling. And looking and seeing the Ukrainian athlete, Yuri Belinog, start his victory lap. And that venue, because it really wasn't made with any of the modern security or structures that you'd have in a normal stadium. I remember walking back towards my bag and rush of reporters and people coming onto the field and just being surrounded by reporters. And then they ask the questions that reporters will ask at all the most inopportune moments, right? How does it feel to lose like that? Boy, so close twice now. And my wife found me on the field and she came and gave me a hug and started crying with her. My mom was being a tiger mom and kind of came in and she was trying to push all the reporters away. I started to laugh at that point, but that's those Olympic moments. And for 8 years, I lived with that as a result and came back the following year and did win a world championship. And then while I was training and competing, while I was in school at Darden Business School, I came back in 2007 and got another medal at the World Championships as a silver medal. And then in 2008, I got hurt prior to those Olympic Games. And I was still training in 2012 and I kind of had a string of unfortunate injuries, starting to get older. That just kind of starts to happen when you're trying to push the threshold of human ability. And that's the real thing about Olympic sports that are different from even the team sports that I played is we're looking for that one-time maximum effort. When you're pushing the throttle and you're trying to redline it, sometimes the engine blows up. And as you get older, you got to tweak that. You got to stay on top of that a lot more. And that Father Time was just starting to take its toll. And coming into the 2012 Olympic trials, I pulled a groin about 6 weeks before, and what used to take 2 days or 2 weeks to return took 6 weeks. And I get to the Olympic trials and it wasn't healed yet. I hadn't been able to practice for 6 weeks. And I knew that I could still do it. I believed that I could still do it, but it just required the perfect day. And literally as we started our warm up for our competition, the bottom of the skies falls out and it just starts pouring. And I'm like, this is done.
Not the perfect day.
No, that I thought was the end of my Olympic career at the time, or opportunities. I didn't think I could make it another 4 years after that. So I remember walking off the field and thinking, well, that kind of sucks. That's not the way I would have written that story, but it is what it is. I got home and sometime in July, I got a call from a reporter saying, Adam, have you heard anything? And I said, rule number one, when you talk to reporters is you always want to qualify what they're asking about. If it's a general question, I said, so I don't know what we're talking about. What are we talking about?
Right.
And she said, well, they went back and retested 100 samples from the 2004 Olympic Games. And 5 of them were rumored to have tested positive. And one of them is supposed to be a shot putter. She didn't qualify who. And I said, well, I haven't heard anything. So I can tell you, 1, it's not me, but 2, I haven't heard anything about it. And she said, okay. So, well, you might want to look into it. So I called USA Track and Field and asked them if they'd heard anything, and they hadn't heard anything either at the time. So the London Olympics goes by, and there's an 8-year statute of limitations at the time on doping violations, retests, things like that. And as the London Olympics click over, I just figured that that's the 8-year statute of limitations had ended and nothing was going to happen. Incidentally, before I go into sort of the next part of that story, I will say that following the 2004 Olympics, I did have a number, like actually 3 or 4 different people reach out to me, one within 48 hours of the competition, one about 3 months later, one about 8 months later, and one about 18 months later, all saying something had gone on there and that I needed to ask for inquiry of some sort.
Did you have any suspicions at that time that Yuri Belinog might have been doping based on just the performance that you saw that day?
No, I mean, like I said, the performance was relatively pedestrian on my side, and it certainly was well within his capabilities based off what I had seen. Mm-hmm. I mean, anything that I would say about whether or not I thought certain athletes were doping would be more about stereotypes connected or rumors about specific countries, some of which proved true over the next 10 or 12 years with the Russians specifically and some of the institutional doping that they were supporting. Mm-hmm. But other than anecdotes or hearsay, I typically tried to look at things as half full rather than half empty. I just seen so many athletes over the years get so focused on what other people were doing or not doing that it really had a huge negative impact on who they were as humans. And honestly, I think it really negatively impacted their ability to train and recover properly because they created so much additional stress So I had taken the stance a long time ago that the one thing I can control is everything that I put in my body. And I'll talk about that. And I can't worry about what other people are doing because quite honestly, there's no benefit of it. And so I wanted to place my trust in the anti-doping movement in general to make sure that they were protecting our interests. And I don't say that self-serving or do say that to lift up USADA or WADA or anything like that. To be very candid about it, what happened to me is both a failure and a victory. And I'll get to that here in just a second. But the idea behind this is that there's rules and there's people that help enforce the rules, and that I have to trust that they are doing what they're supposed to do because it's not my job. And if I make it my job, it takes away from what I'm supposed to be doing, which is really focused on maximizing my performance. That was kind of my general position with things. Following the London Olympics, I think it was the end of August of 2012, I get a call from the same reporter and she says, "Have you heard anything?" And I jokingly said, "We've gone through this before. What are we talking about?" Mm-hmm. And she said, "Well, the IOC is supposed to meet today to determine whether or not to vacate or reallocate the medals from 2004. And no sooner had she finished that statement, she said, "It just hit the AP wire. You are the Olympic gold medalist."
That is amazing. So what was going through your mind when you heard that news?
It doesn't feel real. I wish that I could say that I was focused on the positive aspects of it. I'll be very candid. I think I focused on the loss. I didn't choose to be an Olympian or choose to be a shot putter to make money or to win medals. I started it because I loved it and I had a personal gratification out of it. But it does come at a huge cost to commit yourself and other opportunities, and you miss funerals and weddings and opportunities to be around your kids or your family at really special times and pursue different career paths and things like that. And while it's not what makes it worth it, the difference between a gold medal and a silver medal in my event is night and day. It's the difference between being working class and living paycheck to paycheck and not. And it's not like you're going to go make millions as a shot putter. That's just not the economics behind my event. But in the years following 2004, I had a sponsor tell me, "You've only proven you're good enough for second." And I remember going into the 2005 World Championships and people were basically saying that, again, you're only good enough for second. There's a lot of pain that comes out of those moments. But I'll also say this, the greatest thing that ever happened to me on my throwing career was finishing. It was the 2004 Olympic Games and the outcome that I had there. At that point, that was my second Olympics. I'd lost out at the time on 2 gold medals by less than 3 inches cumulatively. And going from 2000 to 2004, my mindset had shifted into this is a profession versus this as a passion. So it seems like it's not a nuanced or subtle shift. When you're thinking about it as a profession, you're thinking about it as, oh, well, this is what I do to make my money, my earning, and therefore I'm going to compare myself to others. And it was incredibly frustrating because of the economics of shot put are not the same as the economics of 100 meters. There's a title there. There's a marketing opportunity behind that they don't have with my event. That used to frustrate me when I thought about it as a profession. But after the 2004 Olympics, when I lost my sponsorship opportunities, or I shouldn't say they were gone, they were just not at the same level. I went 2.5 years without a sponsor. And therefore the only reason to do this was the original reason of why I chose the Olympic path in general. And that was because it resonated with me personally. And from 2004, after those games, from 2005, really through the remainder of my competitive career through 2012, I had never had a lapse in motivation, never had a regret about what I was doing, why I was doing it, what the opportunity costs were, never thought about it other than this is just an incredible opportunity to do this while I still can. And the fascinating thing about having the gold medal come back to you at that point is it changes the narrative. And it took me some time to process what that actually meant to me. And the thought about, look, the medals matter because that's where everybody else measures success. But the reality is that you can have, and not to sound like a cliche here, but you can have a gold medal process that doesn't win the medal. And I really started focusing on that. And the fact of the matter is, there's nothing that I would have done differently between 2004 and 2012. And I'm not sure, at least from a training perspective, I'm not sure there's a lot of people out there that can say that. But it's hard to not think about the losses. as well.
Oh, definitely. And I like how you mentioned earlier that you tried to focus on the positive. You tried to focus on the things that you could control. And one of those things was obviously what you put in your own body and your decision to compete clean. So can you talk a little bit about what your experience was like with the anti-doping system throughout your career, even before you had this clash with it, with this medal reallocation?
I was really living through, I think, what was probably one of the greatest evolutions of anti-doping and the process behind it. I remember having to print out the old whereabouts forms. And for those that don't know the whereabouts forms, we have to basically tell someone where we think we're going to be every single day of the year. This is before Windows, where you could specify time frames. And anyway, I won't get into the nuanced details of that part, but you'd have to print these things out and then fax them in. I don't know if anybody today even knows what a fax machine is.
I'm old enough.
Yeah. So you'd print these 10 to 15 pages worth of stuff and have to either fax it in or mail it in. And I will tell you this, because there wasn't a lot of clarity in what you could and couldn't take. And I say take like supplements and things like that. My general viewpoint was like, you can't take anything. When I first started in the 90s, like there was no certified clean. There was no, they knew what you need from the macronutrients, but they'd say, hey, look, you need to consume 240 grams of protein a day or whatever it is. So go eat 12 steaks. Anyway, but I do remember as it started to evolve and some of the real challenges that would pop up. I mean, when I first started, the anti-doping movement in general was very much evolving into a space where they were very much, you are guilty till proven innocent kind of thing. And they would show up at your door. It was always uncomfortable, depending on who your tester was, to be quite honest. It was very aggressive. I had situations where I would show up at different functions, whether it was a social function for a family member or like a wedding. I've showed up at a wedding one time. I'd had them showed up at birthday parties. I've had them knock, and if you didn't answer the door when they knocked, you got written up for a missed test. And at the time, I don't think they had a limit on the missed test. I think it was one, and you could get sanctioned. You had to appeal it. So I have seen it kind of evolve over time. And when they started the apps and you started getting more information online about what you could and couldn't do. And I'll share a couple of the differences. I do think what we've done in the US, I think what Travis Taggart has done and his team with USADA has really been an evolution of where anti-doping started. Anti-doping, it's obviously a compliance organization, but they also have to acknowledge that these are humans that we're working with. And USADA, I think they've done an incredible job of saying, look, we want to give you all the opportunities that you can to help us protect you by telling us where you're at. We want to make sure that you're also understanding what you put in your body is 100% your responsibility, but we want to give you as much education as possible about what you're putting in your body so that you're aware of the risk and the challenges there. And that didn't exist when I first started. There was not a lot of appreciation of the anti-doping people when I first started. And when I first started competing in the 90s, that's because it was always incredibly uncomfortable. There was always a presumed guilt feel, and it just wasn't a great experience. Let's be honest, it's never going to be a great experience because of what they're actually doing. But for those that have not had to give a urine sample in front of someone, it is not a comfortable experience. You get used to it, but there's never anything comfortable about it. The frustrations that I've had with anti-doping movement on whole, though, has been inconsistencies from country to country and a lack of connectivity and communication between some of the different levels of organizations, between the NADAs and WADA as well. And those were real frustrations. They played out in a number of different ways. I can remember one time, it was maybe 2007, and I was competing at an event. It was the end of the year Grand Prix or IAAF final. And I'd gotten really sick following the World Championships in 2007. Don't know what it was. Had some bronchial type infection, like literally for 6 or 8 weeks, and was bedbound for about 2 weeks of it, was unresponsive to 2 or 3 different types of treatment. And I've been submitting these therapeutic use exemption forms that you have to use when you're taking anything. I took a corticosteroid for this. You submit a therapeutic use exemption form when you know you're using something that's going to be on the banned substance list, but as part of a medical protocol to cure you, if you will. And I remember trying to stay informed. I was really in touch with USA Track and Field. I was on the phone with USADA all the time. They were incredibly helpful. But in this situation, I found myself being tested by 3 different groups. So I have USADA, our international federation had a testing, and then WADA. And so I was subject to all 3 of them. And they didn't communicate with each other. So I would get a TUE that was approved by USADA, and then WADA, or our international federation at the time was called the IAAF. It's since changed names to the WAF, but they would say they didn't agree with the treatment protocol. Then I'm sitting there I can't interpret this. I've got a medical advisor, my doctor, who's saying, this is what I need to do to get better. But I found myself in a really tough situation. I'm sharing this because I think it's something that needs to be shared. It's not a perfect system. I ended up having 2 rounds of a steroid that just failed to clear out my lungs. And then I had some sort of inhaler. I don't remember exactly what, albuterol inhaler. And at the time, those were banned in competition, I believe at the time. I think they were allowed out of competition with a TUE. Either way, you had to have a TUE to take it. So I needed to go to this last meet because, as I said, the economics of the shot put aren't great. And this is the last opportunity. And since I didn't have a great world championships because I gotten hurt, I needed to go to this meet to try to make the year financially worthwhile. So it's in Greece, and I'm traveling from the U.S. to Greece. And again, I submitted, 4 or 5 different TUEs along the way. And I get to a layover in Germany someplace. And I remember going to find a place where I could check my email. And I get an email from one of the testing agencies. I don't remember which one it was, but I think it was the one that was connected to our international federation saying, we have denied your TUE. I called them back, try to get on the phone and call them and say, what do you mean you've denied the TUE? And they said, well, that's not the protocol that we would have done because they wanted me to do an x-ray of my chest and I'd done like a spirometry test, which is what my doctor did, but whatever. And I said, well, you're asking me to make medical choices for myself. I can't do that. I'm not educated in that way. And it was a little bit of a back and forth. They said, well, show up at the meet and we'll have a solution for you there. So I'm thinking they'll do the test and they'll somehow approve the TUE. And I get to the meet. They said there's going to be a doctor there and there's no doctor there. Well, this is great. So I sent them an email and I said, hey, I'm supposed to compete tomorrow and this is what has been going on. Here's the history again. What's going to happen? We'll show up tomorrow at the stadium at 10 a.m. and the doctor will be there and he'll work with you. I remember I get my agent and good friend takes me to the stadium. I get there and I'm talking to the doctor. He says, oh, so you've been taking this inhaler? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, that's not what we would have done. I said, I understand that, but I'm supposed to compete this afternoon. And he says, well, you're still subject to the in-competition testing. And if you test positive for this, you'll have a positive test on your record. And I looked at him and I said, look, I'm a shot putter. And by virtue of being a shot putter, I'm loud, I'm large, I have a big neck, and people assume that I'm dirty all the time because that's just the fact of the matter is. That's what the facts are. And I said, I don't have a luxury of that if that were to happen. I'm guilty the second something happens. And I'm really trying to do this the right way. I have an email from someone over here from your organization that says you're fine. Before he goes, you have an email? And I said, yeah. He said, well, do you have it on you? I said, yes. And I showed him a copy of the email. He said, show up at 5:00 today and we'll have a better resolution for you.
Oh, goodness.
And I'm meanwhile trying to document all this stuff. I come back at 5:00 that afternoon and my head's not in it. I know I'm not going to compete well at this point because I'm just so stressed about all this stuff. My reputation means more to me than the dollars that I would have won at this meet. And I show up and he basically says the same thing. And I'm really not proud of my reaction in that moment because it's now at 5:00 and I'm really frustrated. And to be very clear, this was just a reaction in the moment. I grab him. I'm livid. My agent is like, Adam, please calm down. I'm like, I'm about to kill this guy. I'm literally threatening his life at this point, I think. And again, I'm not proud of my reaction at the moment. And then he goes, oh, just calm down. Just calm down. And I said, what do you mean calm down? You're telling me the same thing you told me this morning. You say you'd have a resolution. And he says, well, your event's not being tested. And I looked at him and said, that doesn't make me feel any better. I said, the whole point is that this is supposed to be a random blind test. Mm-hmm. And now you've told me that this test, and so that doesn't make me feel better about this process. And so he's like, well, you don't have to worry about it. Then he finishes off by saying, but if you go back to the hotel tonight and they test you, it's still an in-competition test and you could test positive there.
Oh, goodness.
And I walked out of that with such a jaded view of what anti-doping looks like internationally. I remember reaching out to USADA after I got back saying, guys, look, this is ridiculous. And to his credit, Travis called me and he said, there's just no way that this should have ever happened like this. He said, this is ridiculous. And that right there, that made me so frustrated. It made me understand the importance of athletes' rights in that situation and also the challenges that these organizations are facing and the standards that are different across the world. And so that really was sort of the setup, I think, Travis and I kept up over the years, and he asked me to come and testify and tell my story to Congress alongside Michael Phelps. These things need to be sunshined. It's okay to have failures. Like, this is what sports is about. It's failing and getting back up. That's where you learn. But what I see today, and I still see it, the inability for some people to take 100% responsibility and accountability for the impact of their actions or inactions in a scenario. And I get it. It's tough to take that lead, but that's what we ask our athletes to do every day, 100% accountability for everything that you put in your body. And I don't think it's anything other than hypocritical for these organizations at the international level to not assume the same position. We will be 100% accountable and own up to every single mistake rather than trying to defend it or explain it away. That's the only way we grow. I'll stop there because I can rant on probably about that for a while.
Well, Adam, I'm so glad you shared this story because I think it is important to highlight not only the things that are getting better in anti-doping, but the things that are still problems. And I think, like you said, the anti-doping system is far from perfect, but there has been some shifts over the years. And one of these that I think you highlighted is just this idea that there's more focus now or more attention on the athlete experience. And I think this is in large part due to athletes raising their voice and kind of sticking their head out and saying, hey, we need to make this better. So one of the ways that you're doing this, I know, is through your service on the USOPC board of directors. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about what that experience has been like for you and what you've been able to do to kind of move that conversation forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes up fairly regularly in board conversations, which is the relationship that we have with the anti-doping movement and really centering on athletes in general. I think the real shift to sort of name it in a slightly different way, and I think you see this living much more so in USADA than maybe, although I'm more familiar with USADA than the other NADOs, but if you center on the athlete experience, that's who you are there to serve. And the reality is that most of the major breakthroughs in anti-doping have come not from testing, but from someone who said, hey, something's not right here. And it was either an athlete or a coach. So there is a huge benefit to centering the experience on the athletes and making it as athlete friendly, understanding that there are limitations to that too, as possible, and seeing them as a partner in this, because it hasn't changed in some ways, at least this aspect of it. Every single athlete, it's binary. You are either aligned and want to see a clean sport or you're dirty. It's one of the two. So your greatest partner in keeping the sport clean and living up to the standards of integrity that we all want to see in Olympic sports are the athletes and the coaches themselves, because they're the ones that ultimately are going to see it before anybody else, before it shows up on a test. And I think that's super important. And so we spend time talking about that. I don't want to delve into what we talk about at the board level, but it's not always an easy conversation. A lot of it is because of the politics of the international scene. As you know, the Olympic movement in general is incredibly complex relative to other sports. In other sports, it's very simple. So if you play in football in America, in the NFL, you have the NFL and you have the NFLPA. And anything that impacts athletes directly has to be sort of supported or negotiated with the NFLPA. We don't have that. And that creates a lot more complexity and a lot more gray areas, especially when you look at, I think there's 205, 206 countries that participate in the Olympic movement. Not all of them, I think, have their own anti-doping associations. But when you think about that layer of complexity, it doesn't exist anywhere else. So it's really hard to sort of work towards a consensus of what the best practices are, especially when you look at how different those cultures are across the world and what their funding and status is for their anti-doping associations. But I think, again, I want to give credit where it's due. And I think what Travis and USADA, and there's a number of other NADOs that are doing a great job as well. They're trying to create a standard that's in line with what the standard is that we hold athletes to. And that's really important.
Absolutely. And I think your response really highlights just the international nature of sport is kind of what makes it a rich and exciting thing to be part of, but also it is a big source of challenges. And I think it is important for countries and sport organizations to continue to develop or have these strong athlete-centric anti-doping programs, but also to continue to invest in anti-doping science through organizations like the PCC. So can you share your perspective on why this is so important for you?
My situation wouldn't have happened had the science of detecting been ahead of or in line with the science of taking. And this is where I do have some fears, is they have an 8-year statute of limitations. They now, I think it's 10 years now on retroactive drug test. And that is somewhat of an acknowledgement that the system isn't perfect, because those that are taking the drugs are way more motivated, have way more funding to continue to advance technology in a way that creates an unlevel playing field. But at the end of the day, what we want to do with sports is protect the integrity of the playing field. And that means we want to make sure that every opportunity you have is akin to the same opportunities that this person has, and that it's not augmented or shifted by the access to a medical provider, if you will. That requires a huge, huge investment. At the end of the day, as it relates to the Olympic movement, results in the moment matter. A gold 8 years after the fact is not the same as a gold in the moment. There's a certain tarnish that builds up and then devalues what that actual gold is for that athlete. So it's incredibly important for the science of detection to maintain and keep up, if not stay in front of, the science of taking. If you can close that gap, that eliminates the need for someone to receive their Olympic gold medal in the food court at the Atlanta airport, which is what happened to me. No Olympic athlete should ever feel that that gold medal is a trinket. It's a token of doing it just the right way. It is incredible how much that moment matters and anchoring it to the gold medal at the right way. My gold medal moment happened in the food court at the Atlanta airport in front of a Burger King. And I can joke about it now and say, well, at least it came with a side of fries or something like that. But those moments really hurt. And I think they do matter to this country as well. And to every country, you want to make sure that your athletes have the opportunity to compete on a level playing field and receive the result that they actually earned in the moment, according to the rules. And if we don't continue to invest in the science of detection, it'll be easier for those athletes that don't have the same values, or for countries that don't have the same values that I have or that this country has, to continue to create those moments for athletes that are doing it the right way. And there's a real pain that we do need to figure out an answer to. The second part of this is the impact on tomorrow's culture, and sort of adjacent to cheating, or at least is certainly enhancing or changing, I think, narratives, is what's going on with longevity and social media, and people are health maxing or performance spanning or whatever the latest term of the day is, that effectively says we're using drugs to augment our lifestyle so that we can look like superhumans and live like superhumans, and we're going to take all the greatest pictures of it. When you're only seeing the upside, people often overlook that there could be a really, really nasty downside that's just hiding in the corners. So when you think about kids 18 to 25 years old taking drugs that they really don't need, but because someone says this is the only way, they've really cheated themselves on learning what they're truly capable of doing, and probably are setting themselves up for some severe health risks over the long term. And there's plenty of examples to look at. I can remember talking to athletes, in fact, another board member who I won't say her name, but I may have given some of that away there, but she often refers to some of the athletes that she saw from the East German teams back in the 70s and late 60s, and the long-term health effects that those athletes experienced as a result of a systemic drug abuse program, because it really was abuse. This is still an evolving science, and for someone to say that it's safe, I would really push that and say, how are you framing this as safe when there's really we're really in the first decade or 2 decades of research on a lot of the different things that are out there now that are even being promoted from a longevity standpoint too. So I just urge caution there. And I think the final point, which I kind of touched on, the heart of an Olympian is really taking those steps and choosing action. And I think in my own personal story, I often think about Pierre de Coubertin and how he framed the original sort of spirit of the Olympics. And I'm going to paraphrase this because he said it way more eloquently than I ever will. But effectively what he says, in every Olympic journey, there's only going to be one winner, but there's going to be thousands of victories along the way. One of the things that happens if you're not doing it the right way and with integrity, you're always looking over your shoulder. And so you never have a win. You never get the benefit of what you're trying to get out of taking on one of these Olympic efforts. At the end of the day, there's only going to be one winner, period. Well, maybe there's a tie, but there's only going to be one winner, generally speaking. And if you judge your success as an Olympian based off the end result, you're setting yourself up for a massive failure, because that's not a guarantee. I hope that people hear that message right away. There is a real benefit in the struggle and figuring out what you can and can't do.
Excellent. Well, Adam, I appreciate you sharing your perspectives and a piece of your story with all of us today. I think you shared some really great insights and some things that have given us a lot to think about. But if our listeners want to learn more, what is the best way for them to get more information?
You can certainly reach out to the USOPC and they can connect you with me there, or you can connect with me directly on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find, I think.
Well, listeners, definitely check out the USOPC's website to learn more about the Olympic movement and anti-doping. And Adam, we appreciate you joining us today and again, sharing a piece of your story with all of us. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Marie. I appreciate you.
Well, it's been a pleasure to have you here, listeners. Always great to have you with us. Please take a moment, if you haven't already, to rate our podcast and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.